Hello, everybody, and welcome to True Hope Cast, the official podcast of True Hope Canada, where we take a deep dive into mental health's many physiological and psychological aspects. This is the show for you if you're looking for motivation, inspiration, knowledge, and solutions, and that's what we are all about here at True Hope Canada. And True Hope Canada is a mind and body-based supplement company dedicated first and foremost to promoting brain and body health through non-invasive nutritional means. For more information about us, please visit truehopecanada.com. Today on the podcast, I welcome Kristal DeSantis. Kristal is a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Austin, Texas, known for her expertise in relationships, trauma work, and sex therapy. With a focus on supporting first responder couples and addressing men's issues, Kristal offers a unique therapeutic approach rooted in understanding male psychology and the challenges faced by men in contemporary society. Her development of the strong model of relational therapy, which blends trauma-informed and attachment-based methods, has learnt her a reputation as a leading authority in the domain. Her recent book, Strong, A Relationship Field Guide for the Modern Man, offers practical guidance for navigating contemporary relationships. Kristal's dedication to advancing men's mental health advocacy extends beyond her clinical practice. As a trainer, consultant, author, and public speaker, she actively promotes awareness and education on the importance of men's mental health and wellness, as well as the impact of trauma on relationships. Today, we're going to be discussing the evolution of masculinity and the modern relationship. Enjoy the show. Okay, welcome to the show, Kristal. Thank you so much for being with me, for being with us today. How are you? What is going well?
I am doing well. It is nice and hot here in Austin, Texas. So, endless summer, benefits of living in Texas.
I guess so. That's wonderful. Well, we're going to be discussing the evolution of masculinity and the modern relationship today. But before we jump into that topic, would you mind just sharing with us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. So I'm Kristal, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Austin. I'm also an author. I wrote a book called Strong, The Relationship Field Guide for the Modern Man. And that's what I do. I'm a therapist and author. And then who I am is I'm someone who loves cooking, and I have 2 little dogs and 1 big cat, and I'm married, and I'm also a bonus mom. So that's me.
What's a bonus mom?
My husband had a child with a previous marriage, and so cool. I've been a bonus parent.
Wonderful. That's cool. I've never heard that term before, but that's lovely. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Right. Let's kick off talking about masculinity. Like, what does that mean in 2024?
I think that's the big question,
yeah.
Right? And so that's really where I'm, I specialize in working with couples and particularly with men and trauma. I really was fascinated with the impact of trauma on relationships. And so I've gotten some specialized training in working with trauma. And then part of that is I started working with a lot of veterans and first responders and then their families. So, I worked around a lot of kind of self-identified masculine men, in some ways even like hyper masculine, right? I'm in Texas too, right? It's very like masculine men who are protectors, they're firefighters, they're cops, they're veterans. And there was some kind of confusion about, what does that mean when it comes to being a man in a relationship or in the world? Because there has been such a change around what it means to be a man, and what masculinity is. Is it healthy? Is it toxic in today's culture? And I think we're still right in the middle of that conversation as a society.
Yeah, it's interesting that you name a bunch of those occupations: firefighter, police, serving in the armed forces. Obviously, primarily like masculine jobs, and then obviously a lot of specific traits are necessary to be successful at that type of a job. But how do people successfully separate those roles and those personality traits that people take into their job, most days of the week, most days of the year, and then come home and separate themselves from that job and that role, and then coming into being a partner, coming into being a father. Like, how do people, do you think, navigate that?
Well, and I think that's really what the question is, right? Because for many years, for a long time, men identified kind of who they are by what they do.
That's fair.
Right. And so I think it's most obvious when you talk to, police officers or firefighters or military members, right? It's like, I'm a cop, I'm a firefighter. But then when you come home, who are you? Right. And so again, same thing with any profession. So as I started to look into it, it's like, well, I'm an accountant, I'm a banker, I'm an engineer. It's like, okay, yes, but who are you as a person? That's what you do. That's what, that's your production value. But who are you as a human? Who are you at home? And so that is where I've seen a lot of men. I mean, that's really the conversation, right? Are men more than just objects of production? Are they able to be human at home? Do we make space for them to be human at home, or are men only valued for their ability to provide financially or protect through these jobs?
Yeah, I found just from my own perspective in my own life, I found that I'm such a better parent and partner when I have a specific routine and transition between like being in my office space, which is at home, and then going from work mode to parent mode. If my kids are home at 4 o'clock and I'm doing stuff till 3:59, I'm a worse parent than I am if I stop 15 minutes beforehand and I go outside perhaps and breathe, have sun exposure, and just take that time. Stretching actually is really good for me. To take that time to come out of my work mode, which if you think about it biochemically, I'm using very different parts of my brain. I'm producing very different biochemicals and different hormones, stress hormones usually. And then I'm going into my parent mode where I want to be producing dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin, all these completely different chemicals, which will come from different parts of my brain being engaged. And you can be an incredibly zen individual, but to be able to switch one off and then turn the other one on, there's going to be some some overlap. So I find that incredibly helpful for me. And I notice when I'm not being the best parent I could possibly be, I say to my partner, listen, I just need 10 minutes here to just recalibrate. How have you seen in your therapy sessions working with men, and I guess with women as well, who work and then transition into the home? How have you seen the transitions work for people?
I think that's really where I'm a fan of the buffer, right? Is having the buffer between work and home. And it has gotten much more complicated because, like you said, a lot of people now, their work is at home, right? And so you do have to intentionally create that buffer time. Whereas before, maybe it was the drive home. You would have 20 minutes to kind of decompress, kind of put your work self away so that when you got out of the car and walked into the house, you were dad, right? And so just really intentionally having those buffer times of I'm turning off my work self, I'm turning on my partner self, my parent self, which is much, much harder with the modern couple because your phone is always there. Your computer might be in the next room. And so having these buffer zones or buffer times that allow you to transition into I'm now being present with my family is so crucial.
Yeah, it's a huge point. And I just wanted to ask you about, before we kind of move on a little bit here, about the points we're talking about when we're talking about primarily masculine roles of firefighters, police officers, armed services. That's a stressful job anyway, but inevitably at some point with all of those professions, there's going to be exposure to traumatic events. And obviously we can talk about trauma all day, but the worst thing that you see or experience is going to be different to other people. So the worst thing that's happened to you is the worst thing that's happened to you, right? So whether that's I get into a mild car crash or I'm in a car crash and somebody dies, for those two different people, that's their height, I guess. So when these individuals in these roles already in a stressful environment anyway, having to be hyper alert as a firefighter, as a police officer, etc.
Mhm.
And then we have these experiences, these traumas that happen where we are like, we have all this training for sure to be able to like
Mhm.
physically deal with these things. And I don't
Mhm.
know, I'm not a police officer. I've never gone through like the academy or through the firefight training, but I don't know if they help people train themselves not just with the physical aspect, but to deal with the psychological, emotional aspect that comes with, like, trying to save people and put out fires and deal
Yeah.
with violence. I'm
Mhm.
sure there has to be a huge element of that now coming into practice. But when you are coming home to your home environment and you have the added stress of just like that job anyway, but then you've got like the traumas on top of that, how do you
Mhm.
see and how do you work with people who do have those, like, let's just say, added extra stressful layers when they're coming home?
Yeah, and that is something that, it is such a hard shift, especially because our modern world, again, like, yes, the firefighters, first responders, they do get exposed to trauma. And so in order to be good at that job, there is a level of distance
Mm.
that you do have to have, and compartmentalization, right? And so that's kind of, on a broad scale, like, trauma rewires your brain from seeking connection to seeking protection, right? So you got to protect yourself from connecting to all of the trauma that you see. That would just be overwhelming, right? And so in order to come home and be open to connection, there is a process of integration that has to happen, right? And so if you, again, like, maybe on a regular day coming home from shift, it's not that hard. You get to just kind of, okay, let me, process what I experienced today and then come back into my connection mode. But on a day that it's, much harder, you had a traumatic event, you had a very stressful event, again, kind of like you said, are recognizing how much our bodies hold that stress and keep us in kind of a bracing mode, right? We're in kind of a protected place because we just walked through something really dangerous, really scary. And that's something also, again, there's the first responder and the, physical danger community, but it is really interesting in people that have, I guess, more like regular jobs. The amount of stress in a desk job, in a job that you wouldn't be exposed to physical danger,
Mhm.
can be just as high, because our bodies don't differentiate between, oh, this is this kind of danger, and oh,
Yeah.
this is this kind of danger. Our bodies just go into fight or flight mode. We get the adrenaline dump. And so regardless of what kind of job you have, really kind of checking in with yourself, am I bringing all of this stress and dumping it into my home? Or am I able to process, regulate my body before I enter the home? So I'm going from kind of protection mode, where I'm all tense and I'm all bunched up, to opening back up, being open to connection, because that's really who I want to be in my home. Right?
Beautifully said. Yeah. And I would argue that perhaps those individuals who do work in an office space and who are at their desk constantly don't have the advantages of like the benefits, the mental health benefits that come with like physical
Totally.
activity, training.
Mhm.
That's, exercising and being in the gym and training is like is a part of the job when you're a firefighter, when you're a
Yeah.
policeman, etc. And you have that physical outlet that we know is so beneficial. And
Mhm.
you are kind of optimizing your body physically to
Mhm.
let's just say, yeah, work optimally rather than you're just like in an office space inside, not in a really physical position to be like,
Yeah.
really genetically optimizing yourself from a cellular
Mhm.
level. So that's an interesting thing to think about as well. And I was just thinking about, I often think about like when we were, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we were in small communities, small cultures, trauma is obviously not a new thing in 2024. We have been experiencing trauma and that male role of like fighting wars and hunting and, being isolated and, losing loved ones would have been incredibly more frequent and common, 100,000 years ago. So like trauma is not a new thing. And I wonder, like, what don't we have now that we would have had then to help us deal with those traumatic things that would have inevitably happened?
Community, right? Because again, like, if you went out to a hunting trip, um, or you went out to war, like, you had a community, you would process it, right? And so even, for example, like, okay, when the stakes are high and you need to, get that animal to bring home to your family because your family's hungry and you miss that shot, like that can be a very painful experience, right? The stakes can be so high. But if you have a group of other hunters who are like, hey, man, it's okay. We're not going to let your family starve. Like, we got you. We have the community. We can talk about it. I mean, you look at indigenous cultures, when the warriors would come home, there would be whole rituals around telling the story, a narrative, talking about it. What happened? How did you, because also narrative, therapy as a treatment for trauma is so powerful and impactful, right? And so that's the thing that we're missing, is being able to talk about trauma in a way that is supportive and productive. That's gone, right? I mean, well, it's here in the therapeutic community, right? In men's groups, in support groups, in trauma processing groups, but just as a kind of function of what we provide as a society, that's missing.
Yeah, that brotherhood, I think maybe we'll talk about toxic masculinity and kind of like what that means shortly. But I remember when I was probably about 29, and I was going on, I was just hanging out with a bunch of my buddies back in the UK, and a couple of them wouldn't show up to like the normal type of events that we would hold kind of annually. And it's because these people were like kind of like sad and depressed. And I remember one of my buddies saying to me that we were talking about like the ever growing depression within like our, not just our friend group, but like within men in general. And it was something that we didn't notice 10 years ago, when I was 20. So, that's 20 years ago. And I remember my friend saying to me that like, for men's mental health, they kind of just need to go on like 1 or 2 like stag parties a year, and like just like really, like, I don't want to use the word bro out, but I'm going to use it because it's like relevant. Like I do it when I go play golf with my buddies. We get silly, say silly things, like we're egging each other on. We're kind of being like silly guys, but it's really a massive like outlet for a lot of people. And I guess like when we're talking about hunter gatherers going out in groups of men to go and hunt, it would have been that communal factor that would have got them through incredibly harsh times. And I don't know if we have a positive, let me say, a positive influence to kind of do those things anymore. I'm not sure. I don't know what that is from your perspective. What do you think?
It's really interesting because women never lost that, right? Women have always like had their women's groups and their book clubs and their, community, and, girls have wine night and girls go on girls trips. And so I think the biggest thing that's changed is, and well, it's interesting because what you're saying is absolutely like guys' trips are so important, guys having big groups of male friends. But unfortunately, what I think, and again, this, just, I don't know, I can't pull up a research study on this, but what I've seen is sometimes maybe the like it becomes very surface level. So then it becomes unhealthy, right? And so it's not groups of men sitting around and like actually talking about like, hey man, I made it here, I'm actually really depressed, like I'm struggling with my marriage. It becomes, we come together and we drink to forget. And then we make bad choices, and then our wives are like, you're never going on that again, and then we lose our community, Sure. And so that's the piece of that I think is like, absolutely men's like having male friendships and groups of men that can actually show up for and support each other, and not just only focus on the fun and the silliness. Because in our culture too, I think, well, in a lot of cultures, is the part of the issue is the hyper focus on just the positive, right? It's like, we don't want to talk about the negative. We don't want to talk about the hard stuff. Let's just focus on the good. Let's just focus on the high. So then what happens when people are like, I'm not feeling like that, so I guess I just won't go, right? And those are the people that need community the most. But it feels even worse when you're the only one who's like, does anyone want to have a deeper conversation? And nobody does, right?
Yeah, no, that's so important. And I think that, just thinking about my own experience again, I think, so I'm 40 now. And then when the same groups of friends that I had, I've got 6 key friends back in the UK. When we get together, it's a lot less frequent now because I live in Canada and people are a bit more spaced out. But when we do meet up, like now, like we get silly, we get ridiculous like we did when we were 18, but we also like have a much deeper, in-depth conversations about like how we are, what we're doing, and about our family. And obviously that comes with maturity and age. And I think transitioning from being single to being married to being a parent to maybe even being a grandparent, like these are huge big rites of passage in our lives. And the conversations we would have when we were 30 wouldn't really have that deep, meaningful conversation that's like a little bit deeper, but we have that now. And I think that with age, and I think with the kind of temperature of 2024 around men's mental health, we're going into a bit more of a positive route around that. So rather than these silly boy strips just being that, and not just an outlet for that extra testosterone and extra energy that we do have, that absolutely has to be like let loose. Otherwise the problems are going to happen. But also to actually get a little bit deeper with our brothers, I think that's huge. And I've moved from the UK to Europe to America, back to Europe and to Canada, and I've seen people try and move to different countries and starting fresh, and without a team sport, I've noticed people don't do that. I've got 3 friends who I can think of who have tried to move like to different countries and have always gone back home very quickly. None of those people had a team sport that they could very quickly go on Google and go Stockholm Soccer Club, and then very quickly find a football club, go meet up with 20 other guys and train with them, get to know a few people slowly, and then start like playing for a team. I've done that everywhere I've gone, and I've immediately like made like 18, 19 buddies, and then 3, 4 really good friends. And without question, that's the reason how I've successfully been able to move from place to place with knowing absolutely nobody, very quickly putting myself into like a communal brotherhood of sport. And that's why I think like team sports is a really, really good thing to be involved in. So what do you think about that?
Absolutely, 100%. Because again, like that's such a that's something that in this modern world, right? People don't grow up, live and die in their same towns with their same communities anymore, right? And so the positive is like you do have the freedom to go anywhere and live anywhere. Like you've lived in how many different countries, right? But the downside of that is it is difficult to create a community from scratch as an adult. So having an in like that, I mean, that is so smart. And this is also something that I love about the first responder and the veteran community is you could be in anywhere in the world. My husband will, like, he's a veteran and a first responder, literally anywhere in the world. He'll be like, I think that guy is also a first responder. And they can sit down and have a conversation. And I'll be like, how does this happen? but that brotherhood, that community, that, sense of belonging is so crucial, especially again, for everybody, but especially for men, where it is sometimes a little bit more difficult to like, where do I even start to make the first move and find a community? It's like having something that you're like, I enjoy this. And I know there will be other guys who enjoy it, and I can meet those guys and maybe we can be friends. So crucial.
Yeah, it's an absolutely huge positive part of like, our hierarchy of needs as males, and having that community, having that group, having that solidarity and that relationship. And you also see it with like with gang culture. Like the reason gang culture is so prevalent and huge literally in every country on the planet is because it offers that in a negative way. But you can see how people, especially young people, are drawn to that at a quite unique special age between like 13 and like 18. I'm sure we see the induction of individuals into gang cultures, like we see that increase significantly during that time. So it's obviously a clear phenomena that can be wrapped up positively with like kind of the right conversations and the right, I guess, education from young ages and role models, etc. But I want to chat about masculinity a little bit, kind of bring that back. And what do you think some of the more common misconceptions about masculinity? What are they?
It's interesting. What immediately popped up for me is that masculinity is something that you do, not something who you are. And I think that's a big misconception, right? That you can perform masculinity, whereas masculinity is like having, like, being a masculine person is inherent. It's not performative.
It's innate.
It's innate, right? And yet so many of the markers of masculinity that we've kind of attributed to, well, what is a man? Oh, he's a guy with, that he's physically looks like this, or he financially looks like that, or that's a real man, a guy that can blank. And so it becomes this kind of performative masculinity, which, again, like, just from a psychology perspective, is like the internal locus of control, right? I am powerful. I am who I am. My identity belongs to me, versus it's external, which other people get to define, like who I am as a man. Do I have value as a man? And that's where I see a lot of like the damaging messaging about masculinity, is like, it is something that you do, not who you are. If that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. And it's like, when you look at it like that, which I think a lot of people do and our culture breeds, is that you are either masculine or not, which is kind of silly, because, like, it's certainly on a scale, like, you can, people have masculine traits and they have feminine traits, right? Like, it's not like you have it or you don't. So yeah, I completely agree with you. Let's jump into toxic masculinity. Like, what is that? And has that whole conversation, because it's new, like, there's no way we would have spoken about this 10 years ago. Like, what does that mean? Where does it come from? And, is it a positive thing, that this new term?
I feel like it's tough, because on one hand, the benefit is that it brought it, like, right front and center into the conversation. Right? Is like having such an, like, inflammatory title, like, brought a lot of eyes on it. But the downside is that it really, I think the message got lost in the delivery there. Right? Is that people now are conflating masculinity with toxicity. Right? Whereas they're like, masculinity in and of itself is not toxic. Maybe there is an expression of masculinity that can be toxic, but masculinity in and of itself is not toxic. And I think that nuance got lost in that label a little bit.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that there would be traits of just being a human being that would, like, teeter over into just being, like, a not very good person, whether that's, like, egotistical or angry or judgmental or something like that. But, like, I don't see the difference between that being just, like, negative personality traits and masculinity. I don't really see the blend of the two. I feel like they're quite separate. I've never really dived heavily into, like, the origin of this new term, but I just feel like throwing those two words together, you can't, like, not create negativity around just the word masculinity when there's toxic right there.
Totally. And I think where it got lost was we didn't have the counterbalance of what is healthy masculinity.
Right.
So all that got put out there was toxic masculinity, which, like you said, of course, then people kind of blended these two things together, like, oh, that's the same thing. But no, toxic is the descriptor.
Yeah. And I feel like if you were to look at it, it'd be like masculinity, toxic masculinity, femininity, and toxic femininity. Is there such a term as that? Like, it can't be this simple linear pathway.
No, totally. And again, like, okay, so for example, again, just like you said, are these human traits? Yes. And then when we, people, so for example, being assertive versus being aggressive, right? Being confident versus being arrogant. Right. And so the reason why maybe it's put into the masculine bucket is that when you say, like, is confidence a masculine or a feminine trait? Right. And, like, what is it? And again, these are so kind of, like, arbitrary in some ways, right? Is courage a masculine or a feminine trait? I mean, it's a human trait,
For sure.
It's arrogance a masculine, but I think that's part of the, some of the traits that people want to claim as masculine. And then the extreme expression of that, or the extreme negative expression of that, which would be the same for femininity, right?
Yeah.
So like being nurturing, right? It's like, yeah, that's a feminine trait, right? Well, what is toxic femininity? Well, being so nurturing to others that you neglect yourself. Okay. Right.
Yeah, well, we love to put things in boxes and categorize and put ourselves in this reductionist thought pattern where we can easily like create graphs and write on a chalkboard or a whiteboard. You could just like write masculinity, femininity, and just like write all the characteristics, when it clearly just doesn't work like that, when we've just got like infinite personalities that live in the world. And it's obviously a lot more complex than that. So it's our reductionist thinking, and I'm sure like a lot of philosophers and psychologists have worked very hard at writing books to create graphs to make a visual of this, but it just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and it is really interesting, right? Because this is kind of where, I like to talk about like the spectrum of rigidity and chaos, right? It's like one step from either end is, structure and creativity, right? But sometimes we get too rigid with our structures become so rigid. And sometimes with creativity, it feels like chaos. So then we want to kind of veer back to the other side. And because, I wrote a book that is very structured. I tried to put things into categories, for efficiency's sake. But again, with that, it's not the be all end all. It's here's a structure to help guide you through this like very wide and wild forest of relationships, right?
And you have to create that system in order for people to have thought-provoking ideas and kind of come to their own conclusion about these things. Like, I think that's vital that we do that, and we have these conversations, and people obviously heavily differ in their opinions about literally everything, and it'd be an incredibly boring place if we didn't have that. But I just wonder, like, this whole toxic masculinity piece, which is like everywhere, and I'm sure if I wrote toxic masculinity books into Amazon, there'd be thousands of books like written about it, and podcasts and all this. But like, do you think that this whole new conversation, let's call it, I don't know, 5, 7, 8 years old at a stretch, do you think this is actually breeding a culture of emasculated men?
Again, I don't know, because masculinity is like who you are. Right. And so if anything, what I like to, I don't personally like to use the term toxic masculinity, because it, gets so, confusing, is like immature versus mature masculinity. Like that's kind of how I like to think about it. Right. And so you can't emasculate a man who is secure in his masculinity. Like nobody can take that away from him.
Sure.
Right? Because that is who he is. And so I think that is maybe where maybe there are more immature men who are trying to perform masculinity, feel like their masculinity, their avenues for performing masculinity are being stymied because they can't perform it in the way that, they want to. Whereas a really secure, masculine, mature man is like, nobody can take this away from me because it is who I am.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, and it's not something you just like learn in a seminar or in a book or something like that. As we said, like it's something innate within our biology, and certainly within our culture, whether like we like it or not.
Yeah.
And I talk about this often on the podcast, but we don't have what we would have traditionally had is these rites of passage as like young adults, like 13, 14, 15, 16, whatever, like where these individuals would go out into the forests or the jungle, and they'd be out there for days or weeks, and they'd have to use all the skills that they'd learned, and to come back. And when they come back, they're a man, and there's a ceremony. There's a huge big thing. I actually have it in like Jewish cultures, and certainly some like other cultures as well, still around the world. But Western culture, we don't have that. That's why we have these 30-year-old men still playing video games in their parents' basement, because these individuals have yet to become adults, and they have yet to, I want to say, cultivate their masculinity, because kind of everything up until, let's say, 30, 35, until you get married and have kids, you're very much, especially as a man, you are like super selfish. Like, I think, like, what do you think about that?
So it's interesting because I was looking at this of like, what is the Western male's induction into manhood? Traditionally, it's been war.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And so that is also something that I would say is kind of where, in indigenous cultures or in the Jewish culture, is like you celebrate a man becoming a man as like, now you are going to mature into the father, into the leader, into the member of the community that is going to be supported and loved. Whereas in the Western culture, it's like, congratulations, you're a man, here's a gun, go get some trauma in you and then come back. And so that is something that, yes, we do have rites of passage for young men in the Western culture, and it's throwing them into trauma. And so that needs to change. And like, yeah.
What do you think about the difference between throwing them into like wartime and then actually like, because there used to have been like mandated, and there still is in many countries, well, not many countries at all. In a few countries, they still have like mandated military time. I know in some European countries, like you have to do it at a certain age, and you spend 9 months to 12 months away from home at like 17, 18 years of age in like, not necessarily in war, but you're going into an environment that is completely new. You are learning very quickly that you are not the center of the universe, where we have like most men feel like that for very long periods of time. And they're learning like these survival skills, and they're becoming part of a group. And I think there's also some countries where you kind of have to do your year before you're 25, for example. But I think that there's some many positives that can come from like not necessarily going into actual war, but like going into like let's just say a heavy disciplined environment where you would come back with a unique set of skills, and you've actually been pushed out of your comfort zone, whether you like it or not. And you've had to become part of something, which a lot of people never really get the opportunity to do unless they like, find the right partner and they have kids. Because if you have kids and in the right circumstances, your priority list, you go from number one to like down at the bottom if you're a responsible parent, in my opinion. And that's a huge rite of passage. I think for myself, when I was 30 years old, I went through that when I like realized what I wanted to do. I wanted to study nutrition, and I wanted to help people. And then I studied nutrition, and then I got married, and then I had kids, and I grew up properly between 30 and like 33. That's when I grew up. And everything kind of before that it was amazing. It was fun, but I was just like this innately selfish person. Not like I was like going around being an a-hole, but like it was kind of like me against the world, I guess. What do you think about that? I've just said a lot of stuff, sorry.
No, absolutely. And I think this is where I wish, right, in a perfect world, it would be, yes, that 18-year-old teenagers, whatever, would have the opportunity to be part of something bigger than themselves. So whether that's going to, sign up for the National Guard or going through boot camp, or again, this is part of the difficulty in the conversation of like, so, okay, well, men just have to go to war and then they just always have to be sacrificing themselves. It's like, well, so equality in that, but also, being part of something bigger than yourself. So maybe it's a year of volunteer work. Maybe it's a year of being a park ranger. Maybe it's a year of volunteering with the Peace Corps. Maybe it's a year of, building schools, volunteering, Habitat for Humanity. Again, just connecting, like you said, because it really is, especially in the West, such an individualistic culture, right? Yeah. So if there's nothing wrong with putting yourself first, because like literally that's your job, right? Because nobody else is telling you what to do, so you better figure it out. But then making that shift, like you said, and I talk about it in the very last chapter of my book, of, that's the hardest shift I see in modern couples, is navigating the shift from I am at the center of my universe to now we are co-creating something that always has to be bigger than us.
Yeah.
That's so hard, especially when you're raised in such an individualistic way. And so I totally agree with you of giving teenagers or, whatever age, the opportunity to say, and now you're going to learn to be part of something bigger than yourself, so that when you do go out into the world and start looking for a marriage partner, you know how to put something above yourself, right? Not the other person, but your marriage, your family, what's going to actually help them thrive. Because it does have to be bigger than both of you. Right?
Yeah, we don't do brilliantly as a culture now of like dealing with significant change very well, whether that's like becoming married and moving in or having a child. Like I think that it's difficult. I think a lot of people kind of get through it, but a lot of people like do struggle and they self-sabotage with like cheating or drinking or like a lot of these other things, like just coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that I'm stepping into a phase of my life that is unfamiliar, it is uncommon, it is unnatural for me because my past is not my future is not my past, where it's predictable and comfortable. I'm having to step into this new role, and yeah, it can be a very tricky and dark place for a lot of people.
Yeah. And this is where I always want to emphasize, especially to men, right? Is, you can be a good man and not have the skills to be a good partner. And that doesn't make you a bad man. It makes it means that you have some learning to do. And so that is something else that I've found a lot of men have struggled with. Like, I'm not making my wife happy. I don't know how to parent very well. I feel like, am I a good man? It's like, yes, you can be a great person and not have the skills to be a great partner. And that's okay, because you can learn skills to be a great partner. Being a good person is baseline, like what we all strive for. Being a good partner is next level skill.
Absolutely. Right? And when you do find that like right partner, I know that my wife has taught me so much about trust and openness and vulnerability and generosity. Like, I think that finding that partner to balance yourself out, I think that there's a key evolutionary process that we've had like throughout the whole of human existence that has helped young men turn into adults to change their perception of egotistical nature, I guess, and becoming part of something that's bigger than themselves, and getting through that that kind of dangerous forest of navigating that inevitable change. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do that with a partner, and you balance each other out, and you go through it together. It's actually it's a beautiful thing. I could talk to you for hours about so many different things, but I know we're on a little bit of a time schedule here. And we've got to talk about your book, Strong, A Relationship Field Guide for the Modern Man, which addresses the unique challenges faced by men in today's society. Can you talk us through a little bit about that? Like, why did you write the book and who it's for?
Yeah, so I wrote the book. So Strong is the 6 pillars of a healthy relationship. Again, I wanted to distill things down into a simple kind of structure that I could use with my couples. And the reason I wrote the book for men is because there's a lot of books out there already for women. A lot of therapy is already directed towards women speaking women's language. I wanted to write a book for men so that they could feel a little bit more empowered. That, again, these are skills you can learn. These are tools. There are tips. That can give you something that you can kind of hold on to and practice. So yeah, that's why I wrote the book for men. And yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, I have to kind of touch on the aspect that's huge when it comes to stress or anxiety or depression or mental health within men. I've experienced it, but like, it's very common for a lot of people to become like chronically nutrient deficient. And when you are chronically nutrient deficient, your brain is seriously struggling to manufacture the necessary chemicals to make you feel good and give you energy and do all of these things. The brain and the body can only like produce the materials for those like certain neurotransmitters depending on like the nutrition and food that you give it. So I've seen within my own personal experience, and having the honor to work with True Hope Canada and be a part of their like micronutrient team, the fact that so many men who end up like laying down their egotistical ways and saying like they actually want to address things going on for them that's happening internally, but seriously affecting their external world with their partners, relationships, job, etc. And when individuals start actually providing their stressed bodies with the right nutrition, it's quite remarkable how quickly we see, like sometimes in days, how people's brains start to shift a little bit. They start coming out of that sympathetic neurological pathway into more of a rest and digest, and they can actually sit and listen and be with their partners, and they can get down and play with their children rather than the anxiety of like what's going on and money and work like coming on. It gives giving people the capacity and that space to be able to like think differently, feel differently, and have different behaviors. So yeah, I have to kind of like throw that piece in there. Like, you know, we have the world's most researched micronutrient product available to people, and we see such phenomenal things happen with men's mental health. And there's an incredible network here in Canada of people using these products with their psychiatrists, with their counselors, and getting better very quickly, and giving people the space to do all the other things that we know is so important for mental health, whether that's exercise, being within communities rather than isolating yourself, and cooking good foods, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I have and you bring up a really important point too, is that's kind of in the first chapter of my book about being stable within yourself, right? What do you need to be at your best operating self? Like, are you drinking enough water? Are you sleeping enough? Are you taking care of your mental health? Are you taking your macronutrients, your micronutrients? And then at the very end of the book, I have what I call the pizza of wellness. I have like these 8 different slices of, you know, where are you taking care of yourself in all these different areas? And, you know, again, it's not just, oh, I go to the gym, you know, 3 times a week. It's like, great. And there are so many other ways that you can take care of yourself so that you are operating at your highest capacity. Because again, also I see this a lot with so many men where they're like, yeah, I would set myself on fire to keep my family warm. And it's like, yeah, but you also are a person who is deserving of care and nurturing and, you know, all of the good things that you want to give to others. You know, you have to give that to yourself first.
Yeah, there's so many things we can do that are like cheap, easy, foundational, whether it's food, nutrition, supplementation, breath, exercise, cold water exposure. There's so many options for people that like are not that expensive and very easy to just throw into your daily routine. We just need to be able to learn what those things are, create the space, speak to your spouse, speak to your kids about creating the environment for you to be able to do these things, because you're going to be a better partner, you're going to be a better person, you're going to be a better dad. And yeah, it's hugely vital to take care of that foundational piece before you can start building the house that will create the person, I guess, you want to become.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, Kristal, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and talk. I had so many other questions, but every time the best podcasts we have, we just like go all over the place, and we have these really like organic conversations, and that's kind of what we really want here on this podcast. So thank you so much for coming on. Can you just let us know where people can learn more about you, maybe order the book, and and connect?
Yeah. So if you want to find me online, I'm on Instagram at ATX Therapist. So Austin, Texas, ATX Therapist. And then you can order my book on Amazon. It's on Audible as well. I always want to make things accessible. And then my website is just strong.love.
Love it. That's awesome. Kristal, again, thank you so much for coming to the show and spending your time with us and your beautiful thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, that is it for this episode of True Hope Cast, the official podcast of True Hope Canada. If you want to connect with Kristal or get hold of her book or learn more about her work, I'll leave links in the show notes for you to easily navigate that. You can leave us a review on iTunes if you fancy it, or you can also give us a star review on Spotify. It certainly helps. But that's it for this week. We'll see you soon.